branches of legislation take place on a daily basis in South Africa. While companies are often the face of such incidents, there are individuals who are in the position to proactively manage or prevent such occurrences. Such individuals, including environmental practitioners, managers, senior managers, directors and board members, can be held personally accountable if they fail to act.
The Federation for a Sustainable Environment, the core function, the mission and vision and the constitution states that it is to ensure that there is implementation of section 24 of the constitution, namely that everyone has a right to an environment that is not harmful to health and well-being. Also that everyone has the right to access to information in order to exercise their rights. Because we work amongst very poor communities, obviously the issues pertaining to sustainable development, that is the medium or long-term horizons, often do not feature. There's often also no notion of intergenerational equity because of poverty. What often these communities do look for is jobs. They also look for housing, for food for the day. So environmental issues are often of secondary concern. However, it is not of no concern, it's merely of secondary concerns. Historically, obviously, the soft issues like environmental and social issues were ignored by mining companies, but these days, these soft issues are very hard to ignore. It's very hard to also get right when things go wrong. We have seen, for example, with many of these companies like McDonald's, like Shell's, like Mitsubishi, the public, that is the international public and the shareholders, hold them accountable not only for their financial performance, but also their social and environmental performance.
The environmental laws in South Africa are enforced by the Environmental Management Inspectorate. When I'm speaking about environmental law, I'm speaking about the National Environmental Management Act, as well as the specific environmental management acts that have been promulgated under that, such as, for example, the Waste Act, the Air Quality Act, Biodiversity Act, Integrated Coastal Management Act. So, with regard to some of our environmental offences, from fairly minimal fines of about 100,000 Rand, and we're now seeing fines in our legislation of between 5-10 million Rand for offences. I think that with regard to director liability, we have recently started to change our approach in terms of how we do our investigations and the types of evidence that we need to collect to actually start ensuring that the prosecution is successful against the actual employees within the companies that are responsible for the offences, as well as the directors. So despite the fact that there may be enough evidence to prove that a company has committed an offence, we would also need to collect evidence to show that the director themselves, quite apart from the evidence that is required to prove that the company has committed the offence, that the director themselves was personally involved and that they didn't comply with the duties that they specifically have. With regard to some of our larger high-profile and priority cases, we would investigate both the company and the directors and employees involved in the offence, particularly where companies and individuals have actually gained benefits from committing the offence, where we're dealing with large pollution cases, where we can actually trace the harm to the environment to specific decisions made by individual directors. So that definitely where there are high-profile, big priority pollution cases, we would definitely be investigating the company and at the same time looking at the role that the directors played and whether they should also be criminally liable for whatever has taken place. I think it is critical that where you do accept a directorship on a company where there is the potential that the activities and operations of that company can impact on the environment, whether it be through air pollution, water pollution, impact on people's health, those directors need to understand the consequences of their operations, and they need to also understand how those impacts can be managed and what could potentially happen to them in their personal capacities if certain decisions are made and if certain offences are committed by that company. So I think it is critical that directors, whether they actually go on specific training or not need to understand what is environmental law, what are the obligations that they have in terms of that, and what are their duties and obligations and roles and functions as the director of that specific company.
Let me start by saying that the section's badly drafted, but there are methods of interpretation which would be adopted by a court to give it an interpretation which is constitutionally compliant. But I think that properly interpreted, what the state would have to prove is, first of all, that an offence referred to in Schedule 3 of NEMA has been committed by the firm. Secondly, that the accused was a director of the firm. Thirdly, that he or she was a director of the firm at the time of the commission of the offence. It would then be, probably on a proper interpretation of the section, for the director to show that he or she took all reasonable steps to prevent the commission of the offence. The formulation used in section 34(7) is shall constitute prima facie evidence that the director is guilty under the subsection. That formulation will probably be interpreted to mean that it creates an evidentiary burden only. The typical reverse onus, which has been declared unconstitutional in a number of cases, doesn't use the phrase prima facie evidence. It uses the phrase prima facie proof. So I think that this will be interpreted as creating an evidentiary burden and is likely on that basis to survive constitutional scrutiny. The inquiry into reasonableness is an objective inquiry, and it is always fact and context specific. I don't think you can lay down a blueprint in advance as to what would constitute reasonable steps. I think that the critical issue is whether or not the accused was a director at the time that the offence was committed by the company. The fact that the director has thereafter resigned, I think, is irrelevant. The fact that the company thereafter goes into liquidation, I think, is equally irrelevant. I think that the critical component is whether he or she was a director at the time that the offence was committed. The section ought to stand as a very powerful disincentive to directors, and that, in my view, it's a pity that it seems to be underutilized, because there is nothing like a criminal conviction and indeed a term of imprisonment which would focus the minds on those who are abusing the environment, and it would act, I would have thought, as a very powerful incentive to obey the environmental laws.
How did we get to this situation? Quite simply, the pressure of maintaining our business, a sustainable business, keeping costs down, being competitive, meant that our focus has been on the production side, making sure we get the turnover at the least possible cost. We thought that we were also looking after our environmental impact and the other aspects of the business. But what I now realize, in fact, that while we thought that we were doing the right thing for the environment, there were other aspects of making sure that we are compliant that we were not paying attention to. And eventually we found ourselves in a situation where we were, unfortunately, non-compliant.